Okay, well, let's add a glow to this. I like using a chroma key to select specific colors for a mask. So we go right here, in Houdini, press O, and that enters you into the color picker mode for the chroma key. I'm going to hold down left mouse and drag over the area that I'd like to sample. So right around there. If I want another area, I can do that along here, and maybe one more time, kind of stretching out along there. As soon as we have that, uncheck this discard keyed region. That gives us just this. Now we set a blur, set it to a high value like 30 or something, pretty high. Get a bit more than that, maybe about 120. And that is going to add on top of our original beauty pass, like this. Now we have a slider that controls how much glow. And when we hit the smoke over here, we're no longer keying anything because we used a chroma key that listens to the specific color that our fire has. Let's also add a glow that hangs out near the bright points, but doesn't go very far away from those bright points. So we kind of have a general blur happening right now. So that is before, here is after. And now I'd like a smaller blur. Instead of the regular blur, I'm going to use a edge blur right here. And we're going to use another chroma key along here. Press O again, and I'll just grab the brightest spots. So something around there. Let's go ahead and plug that in. Edge blur, and we can go ahead and change how far out that reaches by doing that. Let's go ahead and then use another add, which I conveniently have down here. And we could see that if we zoom in here, we're going to add to the edges of those really bright spots. And with the edge blur, let's take this, maybe bring it up a tad bit, blur size, double that, around 20. There you go. That gives you a sense of what this is doing. So with the blur, don't go too crazy on it. That's actually going a bit too far, honestly. So we'll change that to 15. And on this add, be sure that we have maybe about 0.25 to 0.5 in the foreground weights. Again, you do not want to blur too much. People do that far too often, and it looks totally amateur. So just a little bit of that blur, a little bit of that softness is good, but don't overdo it. So now if we zoom in here, you'll notice that we have some weird artifacts happening around here. And this just isn't quite right. We go to the edges. This is not feathering out properly. That's because if you're not careful, you can actually change the levels of the alpha with the level nodes by default. This, in my opinion, is a very silly default. But if we go to the levels node, we go to mask, and we turn off this section here of alpha. That fixes our issue. So be careful about that. We'll check all of our nodes along here, the HSV, and be sure that, again, alpha is not being affected by any of your color corrections. Okay, cool. So now we have this. It's looking pretty darn good in my opinion. And I can add a degrain, which will help us get rid of some of that grain which we brought out in the shadows. So on the mask input here, I only want this effect to happen towards the shadows. I'm going to use a Lumimat or a Luma key. Now let's actually do a Luma key. There we go. And now we're just going to create a plate, or a alpha that is, based off of the luminance values, the brightness. So if I go something right around there, maybe take up the super sample by 1, uncheck the discard keyed region, look at our alpha, that is now our selection. Plug that into the alpha of our degrain, and on the mask, be sure that we are looking at the alpha of our green wire going into the Luma key. As soon as we have that, we now have the ability to isolate that degrain to those areas This is no effect, a value of 2, got rid of a lot of grain. So again, before, after. And you could apply a degrain to the whole thing. You will lose some detail, so I don't totally recommend doing that. But there you go. We could degrain that, and then maybe we could try regraining that to something that's better. So we plug in our grain right there. Again, we're looking at the alpha. This is a common technique, by the way, to degrain stuff and then to regrain it. That's obviously way too much there with that. But if we take, let's say, the grain size down to 0.05, or 0.5 that is, and we take down the grain amplitude to maybe 0.05 or 0.01, that is a much better way of going about it. So there you go. That's a little bit about degraining, regraining. That's a common trick here in comp. We don't need to worry about vignetting. We don't need to worry about some of that stuff because we're just trying to comp in this explosion. But that gives you guys a good idea of how to generalize a comp. This is before with the smoke, and then after our comp. So before, after. And then if we go to our bright areas of explosion, this is before, after. It makes a massive difference once we have everything happening. So there you have it. Now, you guys are probably wondering, all right, well, is there an easier way of doing all this if I have Redshift? And the answer is yes, you do. Because we have this Redshift post effects cop right here, which allows you to add vignetting, the overexposure through tone mapping, all the stuff that we have on our cameras, which is really useful. Do keep in mind though, that if you're trying to use a LUT, that Houdini does not read cube files, which is honestly a little bit frustrating because that is the kind of LUTs you want to use anyway. But in comp, to apply a LUT, you would use a lookup table right here, and you would have to load in something that's .lut, or Houdini has its own file called a blut right there, which I guess is a compressed cube LUT. So if you want to create your own LUTs, you can basically take 2 images and create it through this lookup table. I'm not going to show you guys that right now, honestly, because I want to move on to a few miscellaneous things we need to get to finish this up. But I just want to let you know that if you decide to use the Redshift post effects, you can't load the cube 3D LUTs here in the LUT file as of right now. So there you have it. All right, so where do we go from here? We've brought everything through the pipeline from A to Z. It's looking pretty good. It's working out. Our render times are reasonable. Now, what I like to do is I like to make a checklist of everything that I would like to critique on one more time. So when you're working on a production, you want to bring everything through A to Z. And then once you've done that, that's when you go through your network top to bottom and you start fixing small miscellaneous things along the way. That might bother you, that might bother the clients. The idea is that you push everything through and then you can rebuild it in a way that you like. So that's always a good idea if you have the time for it. What I'd like to do in this situation is add color fields. I would also like to take a play blast of our comp, try to critique what's going on, try to find little areas of improvement if they don't take too long to improve. There might be a few simulation settings that need to be dialed in. And on top of that, I like to talk about color fields, bring in the spikes, bring in the shockwave, the debris. That all needs to go in there. And that's about it. So from here on out, it's going to be some miscellaneous items. We'll check all that out in the next video.